Hello and welcome to Digestion 1. This is the peritoneum. So if you look at this cartoon, you can see it's probably a mid-sagittal or sagittal section through the human abdominal and pelvic cavity. If you look at the top, you can see the diaphragm. So the peritoneum is enclosed in the abdominal and cavity just below the diaphragm. So then let's look at the structures they show in the cartoon. So this would be a section through the liver, and then find the section through the stomach that looks like a cross section through a tube. Then you can find the large and small intestines, and again those look like cross sections through tubes. In the bottom right you can find the rectum. So let's look at the peritoneum then. So if we look at on the left side of the cartoon where it says Parietal Peritoneum, and then directly across that on the right side of the cartoon is the Visceral Peritoneum. So hopefully you remember from the heart and lungs this parietal and visceral motif. So the parietal portion usually lines the cavity that the organ of interest is in, and then the visceral portion will usually sit over or lay on top of the viscera, aka the organ of interest. So in this case our organ of interest is the digestive tract or the GI tract. So let's start with the parietal peritoneum. It's a serous membrane. It's on the left side of the cartoon, and let's follow it. It's a blue line, so let's follow it upwards, and we can see where it folds back on itself just under the diaphragm, and it's become, when it folds back on itself, it becomes the visceral peritoneum as it sits on top of the liver, and then it follows the liver to the inside, and then it folds back again and comes back into the abdominal cavity and covers the stomach. So that's all visceral peritoneum, where whenever the peritoneum is covering an organ, that's visceral peritoneum. And then the visceral peritoneum sort of dips down and becomes the peritoneum, which is called the greater omentum. So that's like a large fat sort of membrane. They call it a fatty membrane. We'll talk about in a minute. And then the greater omentum dips down and comes back around and surrounds the large intestine. And then if we look on the, let's see, the right side, let's look at the dorsal mesentery. So if we follow the parietal peritoneum, now let's, instead of going upwards, let's take the parietal peritoneum downwards and across over the top of the bladder, and then backwards toward the tailbone. We can see that when the parietal peritoneum moves back into the cavity, it becomes the dorsal mesentery. So mesentery is just there's a ventral mesentery and a dorsal mesentery, and they generally just hold the parts of the GI tract in place. So like I said, the peritoneum is a serous membrane, and it is under the diaphragm. We talked about that. So the parietal peritoneum, I said it's a serous membrane. It lines the abdominal cavity wall. And then the dorsal mesentery is just an extension of that parietal peritoneum. The dorsal mesentery holds the small intestine to the abdominal wall. And then the ventral mesentery is a continuation of the parietal peritoneum into the abdominal cavity as a lesser omentum and a greater omentum. In our next cartoons, we'll see the lesser and greater omentum in a better cross section. And then if you are an organ but you're not inside the peritoneal cavity, then you are called a retroperitoneal organ, or behind the peritoneum. And the retroperitoneal organs include the duodenum, and most of the pancreas and parts of the colon. So if you look at the cartoon, you can find the pancreas, and it's not inside the blue lines, and neither is the duodenum. So here's another cartoon that shows the peritoneum. It shows the lesser omentum. So on the left side of the cartoon, so you've got the lesser omentum that's a serous membrane that's connecting the stomach to the gallbladder and liver. And then below the lesser omentum, you see they describe it as a fatty apron. It's called the greater omentum. So the ventral mesenteries then include this lesser and greater omentum. Included in the peritoneum is the mesocolon, and if you look on the right side of the cartoon, it shows the mesocolon, and that's just a continuation of the serosa or the mesentery, and the mesocolon holds the colon onto the posterior abdominal wall, just as the small intestine is held to the small intestine, or the small intestine is held to the abdominal wall via the ventral mesentery. And the mesocolon contains blood vessels and lymph vessels. And you can see that in the cartoon, those little red and blue tubes. And that's it for the peritoneum.